Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today we're back out at Duelist Den. And what I want to talk to you about this week is the gun that revolutionized combat handgunning. And that would be the first practical revolver, Colt's Paterson model. And today we're going to be shooting a replica. This is made by Pietta in Italy. It was imported by Dixie Gun Works in Union City, Tennessee. And I've had this gun for at least 20 years. I don't think Pietta has a current run of these going. So they're pretty hard to find, but you know what? If you email them, and enough people do, I'm sure they'll get a run going. So let's talk about the history of these guns, of Patersons, and then we'll load it up, and we'll see what I can do at the range. As longtime viewers of the channel will know, I did a Paterson video about 10, 11 years ago, quite a while. And really, I have to admit, Patersons are not my favorite guns by a long shot. They're a little hard to shoot. Because of not having a trigger guard, it actually throws you off quite a bit on thumb cocking the revolver. That's kind of a problem with one hand. And they are very difficult to disassemble and reassemble. Now, by that I mean disassembly is always pretty easy. Reassembly is very hard with these Pietta Patersons. And you really have to know how they go back together. And it's not as obvious as it is on the later guns. There are more parts, they are much more complex, and it's very easy to break springs, especially the hand springs, which are unusual, to say the least. And it takes like 4 hands to actually put them back together. So I'm not a big fan of Patersons. But this spring, back in the end of March, I was at an event at Prickett's Fort. It's called School of the Long Hunter. And it's an excellent event, and I've got a video on that if you want to go back and check it out. But I met a guy there, Michael Despart, and he wrote a book on the Patersons. And particularly it was on an experimental pre-Paterson Colt that he owns. And he gave me an autographed copy of the book, and I read it, and it kind of got my juices flowing on Patersons again. Because there's no doubt about it. These guns started the revolver revolution that lasted through 3/4 of the 20th century. Before semi-autos kind of got the upper hand. And it revolutionized combat handgunning. I mean, we went from single-shot, muzzle-loading weapons, or at best pepper boxes, which I don't consider true revolvers. And with a pepper box, there's no separate cylinder and fixed barrel. The cylinder is a group of barrels, 4, 5, 6, whatever, and the whole barrel revolves. And most of them are double action, and because that whole barrel is swinging around, and because you've got the hammer right up in the center of the gun usually, there's no way to actually sight those things. So if you're shooting farther than a card table's distance, good luck, right? But when Colt came up with this is a true revolver, right? It's got a cylinder that revolves, 5 shots, fixed barrel, sights. It's got it all. So after reading Mike's book again, I kind of got the urge to bring this one out and play. So I did. So I told you all the bad things about them. And I got to be honest, Patersons were not a commercial success in the 19th century. And it's an amazing story, really, when you think about it, that Sam Colt got the idea, he says, while he was on a sailing ship going to India. He was working as a seaman, going to India. From the way the ship's wheel, the capstans on the ship's wheel, the way that was secured, which was basically a ratchet system. And he thought that could be applied to a cylinder on a gun to make a practical revolver. Now, he may have seen Collier's flintlock revolver, which was not a success by any means, which is why we don't call Collier the father of the revolver, right? He may have seen other things, but there's no doubt that he put everything together in a way that worked. And when you think that he wasn't even a gunsmith, it's pretty impressive. I mean, he actually had gunsmiths build his prototypes to his design. And he had a hand in designing every gun Colt turned out until he died. And when you think about the Paterson Company itself, he was 21 years old. He made his money with a traveling medicine show. Giving, pulling into town and giving the rubes a whiff of nitrous oxide and laughing gas, to make them behave foolishly, and putting on a show. All right, that's what he did to make money, and he used most of that money to get prototype revolvers built. And then he shopped those around until he got a bunch of investors that were interested, and he built a factory in Paterson, New Jersey, and it was a state-of-the-art factory for its time. And he was 21 years old. All right, so think about that. Think about the smartest 21-year-old kid you know, and is he starting a major arms company at 21? That's kind of Bill Gates territory, really. So I can't give Sam Colt enough credit. But the guns really weren't a success, and there were a couple of reasons for that. The major reason is that we were mostly at a time of peace in the country. We weren't fighting any major wars. We didn't have major Indian wars going on. So this market was going to be largely the civilian sector. And, this was a novelty. People didn't really tumble on to the effectiveness of it. So it was bought more as a novelty, though a good number of them went west, where they were appreciated, particularly the rifles. In fact, the rifles seemed to do a bit better. The Army Ordnance Department did not have an interest in Colt's revolvers almost until the Civil War. I mean, it's almost shameful. They were actively opposed to using revolvers, and the guys who headed the board up did not like Sam Colt. There was some personal animosity there. So even though he tried for years to sell the Army his revolvers, they didn't tumble. So he never sold any during the Paterson days, except for a group of revolving rifles that were used in the Seminole War. And it got pretty good reviews, all things considered. But the government didn't buy any more of them. So that was a dead end for Colt. So it's kind of interesting. Young guy, sharp, on his game. But he's got what is a paradigm-shifting invention, and nobody seems to want to try it. So that's where we have them. And unfortunately, the plant went out of business, and Colt went on to do a variety of things, including designing harbor defenses. He designed remote control exploding mines. He came up with some pretty interesting gadgets, but he was out of the personal firearms business. So I've told you the weak points of the Paterson. Really, they only have one thing going for them, but that thing is pretty amazing. That a man armed with one of these has 5 times the firepower of a man armed with a single-shot flintlock or percussion cap pistol. So if you've got a platoon of men, each armed with a pair of these, you've basically got more firepower than you would have in a full company with single-shot firearms. If you've got a company armed with these, then you can take on a regiment. And that is pretty amazing. And that's why this was a big force multiplier. So Sam Colt patented the Paterson in 1836. He had previously patented it a year earlier in England and France. So he was trying to cover all of his bases, and obviously he had pretty high hopes for what this was going to do. It was a revolutionary design, and he assumed that it was going to take off like wildfire, that people would beat a path to his door. And as it turned out, that's not really what happened. Colt's Paterson facility really was a state-of-the-art factory for its time. And Colt was always known for state-of-the-art factories. And he was well ahead of his time in that regard. And actually, he kind of helped to create the American system of manufacturing that basically took over the world in the 19th century. At Paterson, they made both revolving pistols and revolving shotguns and revolving rifles. And these guns ranged from 28 caliber up to 36 caliber for the handguns. And they were 5-shot guns, all single action, all made with mostly all made with a folding trigger. On the carbines and rifles, there are some ring trigger examples. There's a lot more experimentation than there were with the handguns. And Colt was in operation for 6 years, from 1836 to 1842. And in that year, he just didn't have the resources to go on any farther. His investors had reached the end of their rope. They simply were not selling enough guns. The total production of Colt's factory was 1,450 revolving rifles and carbines, 462 revolving shotguns, and 2,350 revolving handguns. So not a stellar performance. After the bankruptcy, one of Colt's investors, John Ehlers, went on to assemble an additional 500 Paterson Colts and sell those on the market as a way to recoup losses. And some of those guns made it into the hands of the Texas Rangers right at the start of the Mexican War. And we'll get to that story. So basically, in 1842, Colt was in danger of becoming just a footnote in firearms history. And if that had happened, we would all have been shooting Adams-type revolvers, British patent revolvers, for most of the 19th century. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen really because of one man, Jack Coffee Hayes. And Jack Hayes was appointed a captain of the Texas Rangers, and he had to raise a special company of Texas Rangers for Indian Protection Services in 1843 to 1844. So Jack was a Tennessean. He had been in Texas for a while. He fought in the Revolution. He was known as quite the good guy in a fight. And as luck would have it, when he was putting his company together, Sam Houston called him in for a meeting. And Sam Houston said the Republic of Texas had bought 150 of Colt's 36 caliber revolvers for the Texas Navy. But the Texas Navy had been disbanded, and the guns were just in storage. Now, Rangers were always short on funds, and therefore short on equipment. The men were supposed to equip themselves, and it was that way through most of Ranger history. But Sam Houston said to Jack Hayes, if you want those Colts, go dig them out and they're yours. So Jack went and he checked them out, and he decided those Colts were the way to go. So he outfitted every man in his company with a Colt like this, actually a pair of them. And each one came with a spare cylinder. And that's one thing about the Patersons. You know, you got guys today who say, well, I'd rather have a Remington than a Colt, because on the Remington I can carry extra loaded cylinders and just swap them out, you know, like Pale Rider. And you can, but I see no evidence of that having happened in the 19th century with Remingtons or with the later Colts. But the Paterson Colts all came with a separate cylinder that was carried loaded. And the reason for that is because these things are a bear to load, which Colt realized. So even though you got to take it apart to put the new cylinder on, it's still worth it, because otherwise you cannot reload these during a fight in any way. So Jack outfitted his guys, 2 each of these, 2 extra cylinders. So each man had 20 rounds that he was carrying with him into a fight. And it's 20 rounds that he could use very quickly, particularly the first 10. So that was going to be a game changer for the Texas Rangers. And Jack Hayes went out, basically patrolling around Austin, and he went out looking for trouble, and he found it. He was out with 14 of his men. They were returning from a long scout. They hadn't seen anything. And they were checking their back trail, and they found a group of Comanche Indians were following them. So this wasn't Hayes' first party. It was a small group of Comanche. He could have chased it down with his men, but he knew that in all likelihood that was a trap, that small group was dangled out there as bait to lure him into an ambush with the main body. And he was right. So what Jack did is he started working his men around, and he worked around that group of Comanches until he got on their flank. And he could see that it wasn't just a handful, that there were 80 Comanche warriors lying in wait for him. So the Comanches saw Jack on their flank. They figured that he would head for cover. But he didn't do that. In fact, he went right at him. Now, the Comanche expected that the Texans would fire their rifles, maybe fire a single-shot pistol, and after that, it would be Bowie knives and lances, and that the Comanche, with their bows and arrows and their lances, would have the advantage. So sure enough, Jack's 14 men went right at 80 Comanches. They fired their rifles, threw them down, but instead of pulling out Bowie knives, they pulled out their Colts, and they just started firing continuously. And the Comanche were getting ripped to shreds, and they had no idea how that could be happening, but they knew it was happening. Eventually, they broke off the fight, tried to get away, and Jack and the Rangers chased them down. By this time, they were on their spare cylinders and running out of ammunition, which Jack knew was going to be a problem because there were still Comanche left. So he had one of his guys, who still had a loaded rifle, take aim at the chief of the Comanches and shoot him, which he did, killed him, and the remaining Comanche lost their heart at that point, and they took off, and the Rangers let them take off that time because they were seriously out of ammo. But they had whipped solidly 80 Comanche using 14 Rangers. Now, there were definitely some wounds. This has been a close-fought melee. A lot of the Rangers were wounded, at least with minor wounds, and 2 of them, including Samuel Walker, who was a member of that group and would later go on to Walker Colt fame in the Mexican War, he was very badly wounded by a lance. And Comanche lances were nothing to joke about. So they had to get him and another badly wounded guy back to Austin and get them treated, which they did. But that fight, which is often called Hayes' big fight, It's got about 20 names, but Hayes' Big Fight is probably one of the favorites. That did two things. One, it made Jack Coffee Hayes, a legend. And he deserved it. The Rangers used Tonkawa Indians quite a bit as scouts and to fight with them because they were enemies of the Comanche. And there was a Tonkawa chief, Chief Placido, and he said once, me and Red Wing, his friend, me and Red Wing not afraid to go to hell together. But Captain Jack, him heap brave, him go to hell alone. So, pretty impressive. So Jack's a legend, but the other thing that fight did is it made every Texas Ranger want to have a Colt's revolver in his belt when he went into a fight. And that was going to pay dividends in just a few years. So loading the Paterson is totally different from loading the later Colts. You've got to disassemble a gun to load it. So I've got it on half cock. I'm going to pop the wedge, take the barrel off, take the cylinder off. Now you can see the cylinder does not have ratchets in the back of it. It has a key slot. And you can see instead of a hand, there's a slotted key right there. Goes into that slot. And the ratchets are in the back, and the hand is totally enclosed. So it's a whole different ball game from what we're used to. Now I've got this set for 15 grains because I'm going to be using felt wads. If you didn't use felt wads, you could get 20 in. I'm using 3F powder, Swiss powder, and I'm going to charge 4 chambers. This gun has no safety pins, safety slots, safety anything. So even though Jack Hayes would have loaded all 5, I'm not going to, because I don't have to fight the Comanche, and it's rocky, and there's a chance I could drop that gun, and I don't feel like having any accidents. Okay, there we go. 4 loaded. Now I'm going to put felt wads on them. These are my own lubricated felt wads. Alright, I'm just going to take this jag and just kind of push them down. Alright, at this point, we got to put it back on the gun. I'm going to turn it till that key lines up. There we go. Alright, now, this is a Paterson tool. And this is what you have to use to load it. Now this has a nipple wrench and a pick built into it. Very, very neat little tool. But I'll tell you what, loading these things, I've never found it to be that easy. So what you got to do is get a ball on here. Now, this tool goes into the slot, just like that. And then you push them in. Okay, so that's how you load it. I'm going to load the other 3 up, and we'll be good to go. Okay, now the cylinder's got to come off the gun again to be capped. I'm using my Swedish capper here. And I think, like I said, you can see on the back of these that there are no safety pins. Okay, so we're all capped. All loaded. Now I got to replace a barrel. And I'm going to cock it and drop it on an empty chamber. Like I say, you guys can complain about that if you want, but I would rather not be shooting myself in the leg or dropping this thing and having it go off. Okay, that's how you load it. So I think we can all understand why they sold them with a spare cylinder that you would keep loaded. You can see it's slot underneath here. That's where spent caps are able to fall out of the mechanism. So it's in every way it's a departure from the later Colts. Well, Evil Roy has journeyed to Texas to become a Comanchero. So I'm afraid we're going to have to bring him to justice using our Colt Paterson revolver. So let's see how we do. First shots I've had out of this thing in many a year. You know, people ask me, why do I do these little scenarios with Evil Roy? He's just a target, just shoot him. And the reason is because I did so many years, I guess, of cowboy action shooting that I'm used to getting a scenario with targets like that, and it was always one of the fun things of cowboy action shooting, so I just kind of carried it into the videos, and I guess it became a tradition. So that's why I always have a little story for Evil Roy. But let's go make him ding a little bit. Now, this is a problem with this gun, is without a trigger guard, there's nothing to kind of be a fulcrum for your cocking. So it's awkward to thumb cock this thing with one hand. I'm going to aim at Evil Roy's crotch and see where I'm hitting. There, that's better. And see where I'm hitting. There, that's better. There. Well, if I do my bit, it'll hit. I just find it a little harder to get a grip on one of these things. Well, I'm afraid that today's shooting has come to an end because I broke the Paterson tool while seating a ball. So, I think that's it for today. Well, let me give you some closing thoughts on the Colt Paterson and on this Pietta replica of it. Well, in the interest of full disclosure, besides breaking that Paterson loading tool, which luckily I broke it on the final round of a cylinder, so I had a loaded cylinder. When I went to shoot that cylinder out, after the second shot, my mainspring broke. So, nothing. So, right now, I've got 2 rounds in here that I'll have to unload manually when I get home, which is no big deal, but I'd rather have shot them out. So what do I think of the Paterson? Well, I'll tell you what, it was the greatest gun of its time, only because it had no competition. I think that's safe to say. So this was a marvel, but it had a lot of faults, which is what Samuel Walker set out to correct when he got together to get Colt back in business and made an altogether better gun. So I have never liked shooting these. And there's only 2 reasons I can think of why you would want to have them. My reason is it's an example gun. And I don't mean a bad example. I mean, it's just example gun. I try to have an example of every cap and ball revolver available. And I probably don't have them all, but I'm pretty darn close. And of course, I didn't do that all in one fell swoop. I've been doing it for the last 40 years. So I've had quite a bit of time to accumulate them here and there, and I don't ever get rid of them. So I wanted to have a Paterson 20 years ago because I didn't have a Paterson. And, you know, when you're a gun writer and you're trying to show the progression of firearms, it's handy to have one as a photo model. But I've never enjoyed shooting this thing. And today, I got to admit, shooting it was almost torture because it's just not all that comfortable to shoot. But if you want an example gun like I did, well, pick one up. If you're an 1830s to early 1840s reenactor, well, then this is one of the guns to have, no doubt about it. So you'll want to pick one up. But if your budget only allows you to have one cap and ball 6 gun, this is not the gun you should buy. And I don't care how much you admire them. I'm just telling you right now, get yourself a Colt Navy replica or a Remington New Model Army or 1860 Army, and you'll be a much happier shooter than if you pick up one of these as your first gun. But all that said, when Jack Hayes used it, there was nothing better, and he was able to do great execution with it. So, you know, they certainly have a story to tell. But this one has put me through the ringer today. When I get home to the shop, I've got to do the thing that I hate to do with a Colt Paterson, which is disassemble it, fix it, and put it back together. And you're probably going to want me to do a video on that, but I'm probably not going to because it's going to take me probably 4 or 5 attempts to actually get it back together so everything goes right. And that's just too painful to film. So take it from me, these are not fun to work on at all. And now I got to work on it because it is broke. So there you go. Well, that's all for now. I'll see you next week. Till then, bye.